Welcome to my channel Karma Romance Stories. Please like, subscribe for more videos.
For 6 years, I was the person standing between 50 banking servers and the people trying to break into them. I managed the firewall. I reviewed suspicious traffic. I watched access logs late at night when everyone else had gone home. I knew which systems could talk to each other and which connections should never exist. Then one morning, the security chief called me into his office and told me my services were no longer required. His reason was unbelievable. The company was replacing my security controls with a solution recommended by his cousin, a free antivirus program. I tried to explain that protecting banking servers was not the same as installing antivirus on a few computers. He smiled and told me that I was old-fashioned, so I handed over my badge and walked out. But before I left, I said one sentence that made the room go silent. When the next audit begins, you will understand exactly what you just removed. My name is Daniel Carter, and for 6 years I worked as a network security engineer for a financial services company called Northbridge Financial. The company handled sensitive customer information and operated dozens of servers that supported banking applications. My job was not glamorous. I did not sit in meetings talking about artificial intelligence or appear in company advertisements. Most days, I sat in a small security operations room watching screens filled with logs and alerts. But I understood something that many people outside cybersecurity never see. A secure network is not protected by one magic program. It is protected by layers of controls, firewalls, access management, monitoring, authentication, logging, segmentation, regular reviews, incident response, and most importantly, people who understand what the systems are actually doing. Modern security guidance reflects that same principle. NIST recommends strong access control, audit logging, monitoring, and incident response as important parts of protecting systems. Financial sector guidance also emphasizes controlling privileged access and reviewing who can access sensitive systems. NIST Publications Plus 2. For 6 years, I maintained the main firewall environment protecting 50 critical servers. I knew those servers almost like people. I knew which application server needed to communicate with the database cluster. I knew which management systems required privileged access. I knew which connections were normal during business hours and which ones would immediately make me suspicious. I also knew that the firewall was not simply a wall. It was part of a larger security system. Every rule had a reason. Every exception had a record. Every privilege change had to be documented. And every unusual event had to be investigated. My manager used to tell new employees something simple. If Daniel calls you at 2 in the morning asking why a server is communicating with an unfamiliar address, then you answer the phone. That was how seriously the company once treated security. Then everything changed when a new security chief arrived. His name was Richard. Richard was confident, extremely confident. He had spent years managing technology teams but had never personally maintained a large banking network. During his first month, he announced that the company needed to modernize. Nobody objected to modernization. I certainly did not. Technology changes constantly and security teams have to change with it. But Richard wanted to make changes before understanding the existing environment. He wanted fewer controls, fewer reports, fewer people, fewer security tools, and he wanted everything to be simple. During one meeting, I explained that our environment contained several security layers and that removing one without replacing its function could create blind spots. Richard interrupted me. He said, "Daniel, we do not need a museum of security products. We need one simple solution." I asked him what solution he had in mind. He told me his cousin had recommended a free antivirus platform. The room became quiet. I thought he was joking. He was not. He explained that the software could detect malware and suspicious activity, and therefore the company did not need so many complicated security controls. I carefully explained that antivirus and network perimeter controls perform different functions. A firewall can restrict and monitor network connections between systems and security zones. Access management determines who is allowed to reach particular resources. Logging helps investigators understand what happened. Privileged access controls help restrict powerful accounts. These functions overlap in a broader security strategy, but they are not interchangeable. Richard looked at me and said that I was making the problem more complicated than it needed to be. I asked him one question. If an attacker gets valid credentials and attempts to move from one internal system to another, what exactly will your free antivirus stop? He did not answer. Instead, he changed the subject. 3 weeks later, I noticed something strange. Several firewall rules were being discussed for removal. These were not useless rules. Some controlled communication between different network zones. Others restricted access to administrative systems. One protected a particularly sensitive database environment. I warned my manager. I documented my concerns. I sent emails. I requested a formal security review. Nobody wanted to slow the project down. The company had already announced internally that the new security strategy would reduce costs. Then came the meeting. Richard asked me to enter his office. There was another manager sitting there. I immediately knew this was not a routine meeting. Richard folded his hands and said the company had decided to restructure the security department. I asked what that meant for my position. He looked directly at me. Your position is being eliminated. I reminded him that I had been responsible for the firewall environment for 6 years. He said the new system would make my role unnecessary. I asked who would take over the firewall administration. He said an outside consultant would handle it temporarily. I asked who had reviewed the existing firewall rules. He said the consultant had. I asked whether the consultant had reviewed the historical security logs. He said there was no need. Then he said something I will never forget. You have to learn to trust modern tools. I looked at him and realized that the decision had already been made. I stood up. I removed my access badge. I placed it on his desk. Then I said, I hope your new system works exactly as well as you believe it does, because the next audit will ask questions that software cannot answer for you. Richard smiled. He told me not to worry. I walked out. For the first time in 6 years, I was not responsible for those 50 servers. At first I felt angry. Then I felt relieved. But 3 days later I received a phone call. It was from an old colleague. He asked whether I had been working late before leaving. I told him no. He said something strange had appeared in the network logs. Several failed administrative access attempts had been recorded. Then there were successful connections. I asked him whether the security team had investigated them. He said they were still trying to understand the new monitoring system. I immediately became concerned. I did not have access anymore. I could not investigate, and I did not want to interfere with my former employer. So I told him to follow the company incident response process and contact the appropriate security personnel. That was the last advice I gave. 2 weeks later, another call came. He asked me one question. Do you remember the firewall rule you warned us about? I knew exactly which rule he meant. I asked why. He said an internal server had communicated with a system it was never supposed to reach. I asked whether the connection had been blocked before. He said yes. Then he said the rule had been removed during the security modernization project. My stomach dropped. I asked whether there had been any evidence of unauthorized access. He said the security team was investigating. I told him that I could not access company systems and that they needed to follow their incident response procedures. That night I could not sleep, not because I wanted my job back, because I knew exactly what a missing control could mean. The next morning the company contacted an external incident response team. The investigation began. They reviewed access records. They reviewed network logs. They reviewed configuration changes. They reviewed privileged account activity. They compared the new environment with older security records. And then they found something even more serious. The new security system had been installed, but several monitoring functions had not been configured correctly. The company had assumed that installing a security product meant the environment was secure. It did not. The investigators discovered that important events were not being reviewed consistently. Several privileged accounts had broader access than necessary. Some firewall changes had not been properly documented, and the company had lost visibility into connections that the previous configuration had blocked. None of this meant that the free antivirus itself was evil. That was never the real lesson. The problem was believing that one product could replace an entire security architecture. NIST guidance specifically emphasizes that security involves multiple controls, including access control, audit and accountability, system and communications protection, and incident response. NIST Computer Security Resource Center. The investigation continued. Then the auditors arrived. They did not care about the marketing presentation for the new security system. They wanted evidence. Who had access? Why did they have access? Which accounts had elevated privileges? Which network connections were permitted? Who approved the changes? Where were the logs? Who reviewed them? What happened when something suspicious appeared? Those questions were exactly the questions I had warned about. NIST guidance for financial services also emphasizes reviewing access rights, tightly controlling elevated privileges, and securely maintaining security logs. The audit eventually revealed that the company had made several changes without properly validating the security consequences. There was no single catastrophic mistake. There was something more dangerous. A chain of small decisions. A firewall rule removed. A privilege left to broad. a log not reviewed, a monitoring alert not configured correctly, a security assumption accepted without testing. Each decision looked harmless by itself. Together they created a serious weakness. Richard was questioned by senior management. The consultant was asked to explain the changes. The security team had to reconstruct months of activity. And my former manager called me again. This time he apologized. He said, "You were right." I told him I did not want to hear that. I wanted to know whether the systems and customers were safe. He said they were working with investigators and had contained the issue. I told him that was what mattered. Then he asked whether I would come back. I thought about it. 6 years of my life had been spent protecting those systems. But I remembered the day they told me that my experience was no longer necessary. So I said no. I had already moved on. The story could have ended there. But months later, I received a copy of a public security report that described the importance of layered controls, access management, logging, and incident response. As I read it, I realized something. The report never mentioned me. It did not need to. The lesson was bigger than one employee. Security is not about trusting the person with the loudest voice. It is not about buying the cheapest product. It is not about installing one application and declaring victory. And it is definitely not about assuming that because something has the word security in its name, everything around it is secure. The strongest security programs are built around layers. They monitor, they restrict, they verify, they record, they test, and when something goes wrong, they investigate. That is why the sentence I said before leaving stayed with me. The next audit will tell you what you removed. I never wanted that sentence to become true, but it did. 6 years earlier, I had walked into that company believing my job was to protect 50 banking servers. Years later, I understood that my real job had been protecting the space between confidence and reality. The company had not failed because it trusted technology. It failed because it stopped questioning whether the technology was actually doing the job. A security product can be useful. A firewall can be powerful. Antivirus can be valuable. Automation can save time. But none of them replaces judgment. The most dangerous sentence in cybersecurity is not "we have no protection." It is "we already have enough protection," because that sentence can make people stop looking. And when people stop looking, the attackers only need one opening. I handed over my badge that morning because I had been told my experience was no longer needed. But when the audit arrived, they discovered exactly why that experience had mattered. I did not lose my job that day. I simply stopped being responsible for a decision that was never mine to make. And sometimes walking away is not giving up. Sometimes walking away is the moment you finally realize that you warned them clearly enough.